Hello, my name is Peter Sjöstedt-Hughes, and I shall be talking about Spinozism and the psychedelic amor intellectualis, or the intellectual love of God. Essentially, this talk then is about understanding certain unitive states occasioned by psychedelics through a Spinozan lens. Here's the plan. First of all, I'll give an outline of a bit more of a detailed outline of what I'm about to say, or my argument. Then I'll talk about Spinoza and Spinozism, coming to its culmination in the intellectual love of God. Thereafter, I'll be looking at 5-MeO-DMT phenomenology. 5-MeO-DMT is a particularly potent substance, psychedelic substance. And then I'll compare that phenomenology to Spinoza's idea of the intellectual love of God, and then end with some remarks about how this sort of abstract metaphysical understanding can have at least real practical benefits, especially as regards the ecological crisis. So here's a slightly more detailed outline of what I'll be saying. So I'd like to present Spinozism as a natural paradigm, one that goes beyond dualism, it goes beyond understanding body and mind as separate substances. It also goes beyond physicalism, or materialism, that everything can be reduced to matter or the physical. It also goes beyond idealism. And I want to present it as a sort of the most rational framework for understanding reality. I'll then show how it culminates with this variously interpreted notion of the amor intellectualis, or the intellectual love of God, and I shall show how the intellectual love of God substantiates Spinozism. Then we'll see how the intellectual love of God resembles certain unitive psychedelic experiences, especially that of 5-MeO-DMT. And thus we result in a psychedelic Spinozan symbiosis, that certain psychedelic states can be understood through Spinozism, and in turn Spinozism can be intuited through certain psychedelic states. And then I shall show the epistemic and ecological benefits of this symbiosis. So let's begin with Spinoza himself. Spinoza, Baruch, and later Benedict de Spinoza, lived from 1632 to 1677. He was a Sephardic Jew. The Sephardim, they were expelled from the Iberian Peninsula unless they converted to Christianity, and some of them ended up in Amsterdam, a very liberal city. Then as now, and that's where Spinoza. That was the sort of background of Spinoza himself. He was part of the Sephardic community in Amsterdam. However, he was excommunicated by his fellow Sephardim, his fellow Jews, due to radical opinions, radical views that he held in his 20s. Even someone even tried to assassinate him, tried to stab him. He was he was accused of atheism during his life, at the time a serious accusation, and his books were eventually banned by the church. So he was he published his books anonymously and then posthumously. He knew the danger of his own views. In fact, he famously turned down a professorship in philosophy at Heidelberg because he said he didn't know how to teach philosophy without being a disturber of the peace. And then for 100 years after his death, his name was vilified. There were certain cases of people expressing sympathy to Spinoza and his thought who were seriously punished for that. One could lose one's job, one's accommodation, one's pension, and so on. This culminated in the so-called pantheism controversy of the 1780s, so a century after his death, which started getting intellectuals speaking about him openly and expressing sympathy openly, And then he became a canon really in the Western pantheon of philosophers. But this was sort of too late. Descartes' view, Descartes' substance dualism, which he sought to fix, as it were, that had taken hold. And that was good for both Christianity, but also for the modern scientific age, for reasons I'll speak about later. But Spinoza, nonetheless, was very influential. He influenced Goethe, Hegel, Schopenhauer. He influenced Wordsworth in Britain, and the Romantic or the Lake poets, Coleridge, Humphrey Davy, and so on. He also had a big influence on higher criticism, the analysis of the Bible, saying that it wasn't solely written by, for example, Moses, or the first 5 books were not written by Moses alone. This is also why he was vilified. But this became very popular in Germany, in the 19th century, of course. He influenced as well Nietzsche, Deleuze, Borges, George Eliot, Einstein, and as I shall speak about at the end, he was a big influence on the Norwegian founder of deep ecology, Arne Næss. He's been variously interpreted as an atheist, as an idealist, as a materialist, and so on. I'll give you my interpretation, which I think is a standard interpretation. So what is his thought exactly then? Why did he get into so much trouble? Here's a general schema of his metaphysics. This is from another video lecture I created, which you can see if you just search for Spinozism synopsis online, where you can treat that as an appendix, as in a sense. But I'll give you an outline here. So for Spinoza, then, there wasn't 2 substances, or 3 really, with Descartes. There wasn't mind, matter, and God. There was only one substance. And he called that one substance the underlying fundamental reality, that which everything can be essentially reduced to, which everything is dependent upon. He called that one substance God. But he also called it nature. And this is part of the reason why he got into trouble. Because certain people thought, well, if you're going to call God nature, then you might as well say you're an atheist. You might as well say there is no God. And in one sense, he is an atheist if you take theism to mean that there exists a transcendent God. In other words, a God outside of nature. But I don't think it's fair to call Spinoza an atheist for reasons that will become apparent in a moment. So there's one substance, and there are not 2, there's not an infinity of substances as Leibniz had it. There's one fundamental substance, which is the universe, the cosmos, nature, or reality. You can call it existence itself. Now, of this substance, there are an infinity of attributes, of which we humans can access 2. And those 2 are thought and extension, or sentience and physical space. So for Descartes, sentience, or mind, and matter were 2 things that interacted. And it was always problematic for Descartes to explain how this interaction took place. But for Spinoza, these 2 attributes are expressions of the same thing, the same substance, just like the morning star and the evening star are both representational of the one planet, Venus. We have access to these 2 attributes, thought and extension, but there are an infinity of other attributes. And each of those attributes, he says in a letter, has its own sentience, interestingly, which is something one can explore later with regard to psychedelic states, but not one I'm going to look at today. And within these attributes, there is a plurality of modes, and modes simply means modifications. So, for example, a mode of thought would be a particular idea one might have at a particular time, and a mode of extension would be, for example, a particular physical thing. Now, because thought and extension are both attributes or expressions or versions of the same thing, it implies that there is a parallelism between thought and extension throughout the whole cosmos. So it's not that thought, or rather sentience, and the brain are the only things that are one and the same thing. It's rather that sentience and all things are parallel. So this is also known as panpsychism, and Spinoza presents a certain type of panpsychism. It's in Spinoza's scholarship, it's referred to as parallelism, but essentially it means the same thing. You can also see Spinoza as a monist then, that everything ultimately is this one substance. You can see it as a neutral monism, because thought, extension, and all the other attributes are all then expressions of this one thing. So this neutral monism is one whereby thought and extension are not emergent from this one substance, but thought and extension are part of this one substance, but there is much more. So thought and extension are not other than substance, they are part of this one substance. Now, at the top there, we see the fact that if you identify God with nature, you are, of course, expressing a pantheism. Pantheism is a term that was coined by Joseph Raphson 20 years after Spinoza's death. And he contrasted that to panhylism, which is essentially a form of materialism. But Spinoza was then the original pantheist, really. And there's a great late Swedish philosopher called Patrick Lundborg, who claimed that monism, or holism, and pantheism were core psychedelic values. If one accepts that, then of course to fully understand those psychedelic values, one needs to go to the core, and that is Spinozism itself. So that's a very brief outline of Spinozism, and I advise you, if you have time, to look at my other video on it. Now, Spinozism culminates in the intellectual love of God. I should say that the greatest exposition of Spinozism is in his book, The Ethics. And that consists of 5 parts, and the 5th part ends with this amor intellectualis, the intellectual love of God, which is unusual because a lot of scholars are rather confused by this late notion in the ethics. Some people think it's just a sort of add-on to placate the religious authorities, and it's variously interpreted, as I say. The greatest conflict of it comes with the conflict is between the intellectual love of God and Spinoza's famous mind-body parallelism. I mean, Einstein loved Spinoza due to his parallelism. He says, quote, "Spinoza is the greatest of modern philosophers because he is the first philosopher who deals with the soul and the body as one, not as 2 separate things." So this is the appeal of Spinozism. That means that when the body dies, so does the mind, because they are essentially the same thing. This is another way of looking at this parallelism. You have, from one direction you see thought, from another direction you see extension. They are both expressions of the one thing. So you would think if that one thing, in this case the human body, dies, then the mind must die as well. However, near the end of the Ethics, Spinoza writes this, quote, "The human mind cannot be absolutely destroyed along with the body, but something of it remains, which is eternal." That which remains, which is eternal, is not a soul, then, enduring beyond the corpse, because Spinoza was not a dualism. There's no such thing as a soul, but rather as mind collapsing into eternity. And by eternity, Spinoza doesn't mean infinite time or infinite duration. He means, following a long line of thought, which is perhaps best exemplified in the Neoplatonists, he means timelessness, being outside of time. Frederick Pollock, a great Spinozist, a great commentator in the 1800s, wrote, "Spinoza's eternal life is not a continuance of existence, but a manner of existence." Errol Harris, 1971, writes something similar. The eternity of the immortal part of the human mind is not a continued duration after the death of the body, but a quality of being. And we see here already, perhaps, a link to what I'll say about psychedelic states later. Now, this notion of immortality being a stepping outside of time, as it were, has a precedent that one finds in Aristotle, De Anima, where on the soul, Aristotle's book on the soul, where he speaks about such a thing. Also, possibly in Timaeus by Plato. But one sees it even more so, or even more explicitly in Maimonides, an Aristotelian theologian, philosopher, in his great Guide of the Perplexed. Maimonides was a great influence on Spinoza, even though Spinoza ostensibly criticized him in many ways. This eternality can be achieved whilst the body is alive. It's not simply after death. And this cannot be achieved through imagination or opinion. One cannot imagine eternality and thus achieve it. Imagination, opinion, or sensibility is what Spinoza calls the first kind of knowledge. It can neither be achieved through reason and conceptualization, or through logic or science. This is the second kind of knowledge, as Spinoza has it. It can only be achieved, this stepping into eternity, this immortality, this strange form of immortality, can only be achieved through what he calls intuition, which he also calls the third kind of knowledge, which he writes is particularly difficult and rare to achieve. But it can be achieved. Deleuze, for example, writes that the soul's eternity can indeed be the object of a direct experience. This is from his book Expressionism and Philosophy of Spinoza. So he's got two books on Spinoza, and they're both very good. So this rare state then, the culmination of this third kind of knowledge, intuition, he calls the amor intellectualis. This is the intellectual love of God. And here are some quotations by Spinoza himself. He writes, "This is the greatest striving of the mind and the greatest virtue." He says that in other books as well. It's the pinnacle, almost the meaning of life. "The intellectual love of God, which arises from a third kind of knowledge, is eternal." Or, eternity is the very essence of God, nature. I should say this, that that substance of which thought and extension were expressions of, that substance in itself, in other words, not seen through the abstractions that are the attributes, is timeless, is eternal. It's not part of duration. It doesn't exist in itself through duration. It's humans who see, humans and other beings who see that substance. We see it in our own way, and we see it in temporality. But in itself, it is not temporal. And so, in a sense, this is the concrete essence of reality, just as Minkowski and Einstein had it. It is atemporal. Another quotation, "The third kind of knowledge proceeds from an adequate idea of certain attributes of God to an adequate knowledge of the essence of things." An adequate knowledge of the essence of things. Thought and extension, those attributes, can be seen as abstractions, as Whitehead might call it. In other words, they are extracts and perspectives upon that true eternal reality. It is not the reality itself. So, intuiting this reality is to identify with it. We don't represent it. Thought and extension are representations, expressions of God. Intuition goes beyond the representation to the identification. There's only the one concrete reality, God, nature, substance. And so, as a result of that, the subject-object dichotomy, which pertains to the first two kinds of knowledge, is effaced. It no longer exists in this intuition, in this third kind of knowledge. There is no representation, there is no abstraction, there is just pure identity with the essence. And this is why Spinoza writes the following: The mind's intellectual love of God is the very love of God by which God loves himself, i.e., the mind's intellectual love of God is part of the infinite love by which God loves himself. So, in other words, in the intellectual love of God, you, your body-mind, become God. God becomes you. And because God, or nature, is eternal, you thus become eternal. And this is the achievement of intuition. Another way to put it is that the human mind becomes eternal or immortal when it steps outside time to unite with God or nature. I should say this about God as well, or Spinoza's God. God is not emotional. Spinoza says explicitly that God does not love you. He doesn't hate you either. He doesn't have emotions. He's not a judgmental God either. In many ways, you can see Spinoza as a type of nihilist, essentially saying that might is right. There are no natural rights for him. So he's not omnibenevolent in this sense at all. Good and evil are just products, like time, like duration, of the human mind. Time, really, for Spinoza, is the measure of duration. Now, a lot of Spinoza scholars then dismiss this third kind of knowledge, or they conflate it with the second kind of knowledge, or they say it's a blip, a little ad hoc augmentation of the ethics. But you can see it in his other works as well. For example, in Spinoza's short treatise, he talks about the congruence of parallelism and immortalism, this form of immortalism. He writes there in the chapter of the immortality of the soul, he writes, quote, "The soul can be united either with the body or with God, nature, without whom it can neither exist nor be understood." Another quotation, "Our first birth was when we were united with the body, but our other or second birth will occur when we become aware in ourselves of the completely different effects of love produced by knowledge of God, nature. This, therefore, may be more rightly and truly be called rebirth." So in other words, for Spinoza, there are two parallelisms. There's the common mind-body parallelism, which is then representational. One sees other things as distinct from oneself, and one understands God and nature as distinct from one's being as well. This form of parallelism is abstract, so we use thought and extension as our lenses by which we understand reality, those lenses being the attributes. It is temporal, as I mentioned, durational, and is thus divisive. The second type of parallelism, which is the intellectual love of God, which is the parallel between the mind and God nature, is then intuitional. It's not abstract, it's concrete, it's an adequate understanding of substance. It's thus substantial, rather than attributive. It's eternal or timeless, and it's then the becoming one with God nature. It's thus unitive. So Spinozism can be understood intellectually via then the second kind of knowledge, reason, science, logic as detail, and this can be understood then through Spinoza's books, especially the ethics. But Spinozism, in its truth, can also be directly intuited via the third kind of knowledge. So the intellectual love of God, as the pinnacle then of the third kind of knowledge, yields direct access and identification with the eternal substance. This is somewhat akin to Kant's notion of intellectual intuition, which Kant says is impossible for humans. But here we have it as a rare form of statehood for human beings. So, in other words, the intellectual love of God is the direct intuition of that which rational Spinozism is the representation. The reasoning substantiates the intuition, and in turn the intuition substantiates the reasoning. This is the epistemic symbiosis of the two. Now, what I'm going to say, pushing this further, I'm going to say if certain psychoactive substances occasion the intuition, if this intellectual love of God can be occasioned by psychedelic experiences, then one might speak of a further psychedelic Spinozan symbiosis. In other words, psychedelics give one the intuition of Spinozism, and Spinozism in turn gives a rational framework in which one can understand certain psychedelic unitive states. Many, again, reading the literature on Spinoza and this intuition, this third kind of knowledge, it becomes clear that a lot of scholars don't really just can't get their head around this notion, and I think one of the reasons is that it is a form of experience, or a form of perhaps beyond experience, a kind of state one finds oneself in, one can find oneself in. And a lot of scholars obviously have never been in this state, and so it just cannot be apprehended by many people. It's a bit like trying to, speaking of colours to the congenitally blind. They just cannot be understood. But it does seem that Spinoza is serious in saying that this state is real. It's not a sort of prolongation of the second kind of knowledge. It is a separate state entirely. It is not sensible. It's not perceptual. It's not cognitive. It's not intellectual. It is intuitive. I should quickly say something about that, because of course he does call it the intellectual love of God, and this is really a misnomer, because it's not intellectual. I mean, it's not the second kind of knowledge. It's not love either, because he says it's without emotions, without the effects, because the effects only pertain to the body, cognition of the body. And really, it's not really of God as we understand God. It's of nature or the cosmos as a whole. So why does he call it this? Well, partly it's because of it's part of the legacy that one sees from Aristotle through the Neoplatonists, perhaps through to Maimonides and other Jewish thinkers especially, who used the divine love of God or the intellectual love, divine love of God, and so on. It's a continuation of the usage of the term. Intellectual really refers to the fact that though God is not emotional and not judgmental, there is an aspect of him which is known as the infinite intellect, and it is a bonding of one's mind with this infinite intellect. In other words, the finite mind to the infinite mind. That is this third kind of knowledge, this intellectual love of God. So love here doesn't mean love as we understand it at all. It means a bonding. And God means the cosmos as a whole, nature as a whole. But of course, nature is enriched through Spinozism. Nature is not just the physicalist notion of dead matter or whatever. It has, the physicality of nature is just one of its infinite attributes. The cognitive side of nature is the infinite intellect, and that is what is important here, and that is why he called it the intellectual love of God. He also then refers to this love as blessedness, and he says it's also called glory in the sacred scriptures. So by identifying it with glory, we see suddenly that it's not simply a rational, intellectual form of knowledge. It goes beyond that to the religious. Glory in Latin is gloria, in Hebrew it's kavod. In English, it's also translated as God's presence or his radiance. And we see that this notion of identifying this merging of the finite mind into the infinite intellect, we see that as a legacy from especially Maimonides then, who lived in the 12th century. For example, Maimonides writes this, quote, "It is said, when thy righteousness goes before thee, the glory of the Lord shall gather thee in." Isaiah 58:8. End quote. Within quote, "Once it has entered upon eternal life, that intellect remains permanently in one state." Maimonidean scholars, in fact, see Spinoza's intellectual love of God as the culmination of this Jewish thought. Moreover, Maimonides writes, this state, this glory state, this intellectual love of God is, quote, the point of all religious practices. Now let's begin to link this more to psychedelic phenomenology. Religious practices such as dieting, isolation, sensible isolation, meditation, and so on, diet and so on. These are all forms of religious practices that for Maimonides help bring about this primal, this pinnacle state of being. Now, William James argued, and many have argued since, that psychedelic states or psychoactive drugs can occasion religious states. For example, he writes this in 1902. The next step into mystical states carries us into a realm that public opinion and ethical philosophy have long since branded as pathological. I refer to the consciousness produced by intoxicants and anesthetics. So William James talks about alcohol as the first step into the mystical consciousness, then talks about ether, but especially nitrous oxide. In fact, he said that nitrous oxide made him understand more than anything Hegel's philosophy. So there is a precedent set here for understanding certain philosophies through psychedelics. I'm going to be making the case similarly that 5-MeO-DMT can bring about an understanding of Spinozism rather than Hegelism. Also interesting, I should say, that even in 1902, people believed that such drug use was considered pathological, diseased, a condition with a negative value. So let's look at 5-MeO-DMT, 5-methyloxyl. People say that philosophical words are bad. 5-methoxy-NN-dimethyltryptamine. 5-MeO-DMT is possibly the most powerful of all psychedelics, the most potent, perhaps. It was first synthesized in 1936, although it took 20 years before it was realized that it was psychoactive. In the 1950s, it was identified as active within certain trees and shrubs in the Americas, also in Amerindian snuffs, and as such as psychoactive. In fact, this might have been used by Amerindian people for thousands of years. I think the research is ongoing. In the 1960s, it was identified in the venom of Bufo alvarius, the Sonoran desert tide, or the Colorado river toad. And you can then extract this from the back of the toad, but it can be synthesized as well. In the West, it originally was synthesized anyway, and this seems to be more beneficial for the toad's survival than extracting it from the poor creature. Let me talk about, very briefly, 5-MeO-DMT phenomenology. I should say this whole talk is a chapter in the forthcoming Bloomsbury volume associated with this conference. But anyway, so 5-MeO-DMT can be smoked as a vapor, and commonly this is the onset, that which happens when one first inhales it after a few seconds. Very commonly one sees a white light. Everything becomes white. There are perhaps hexagonal, sort of mild hexagonal patternations that within the white light, but generally this overwhelming white light. Not in a tunnel, just pure whiteness. There's also terror, really, especially the first times one takes it. There's a shock. I mean, I'm talking within the space of a few seconds. But there's a shock of losing all one's control, all one's willful control, one's mental causation, one's will. Losing all perception, both of externality and internally, or rather that just becomes white, as I say. And also losing all cognition, all concepts and inferences, and so on. At the start, one still has a little bit of those things, and so one can judge quickly what's going on. This, of course, fits nicely into William James's notion of passivity, one of the four marks of the mystical state. And then there's this fundamental sense of a fundamental change of state. One realizes that this is very different. This is ineffability is another mark of the mystical state, I should say, for James. But this one realizes that things are not quite right. Even thinking about it is emotional because of its power, its strength. It's quite common, it seems, that one has a fear of death here as well, because one thinks, "Oh my God, did one take too much? Is this right?" You can't get out of it, With alcohol, sometimes you can, if one is overly intoxicated, one can perhaps, in an emergency situation, sort of force oneself out of it and do practical things properly. Not here. One is completely passive. And one wonders if this is death itself. And then one goes into it. Here are some, this is not exhaustive, but here are some fundamental aspects of 5-MeO phenomenology. First and foremost, there's this sense of extreme profundity. Something of profound significance is being experienced, or one is becoming. Apart from that, the experience is non-emotional, because what Spinoza would call one's conatus, one's desire to persevere in one's being, or one's survival instinct, or one's general desires, are completely gone, and all the derivative emotions from desire are gone. However, this extreme profundity, interestingly, is value-laden, but without desire. One can see it almost as the ultra-sublime. If one looks at that literature that Edmund Burke and Kant and Schopenhauer and so on spoke of 200 years ago. Schopenhauer said, "The problem of beauty is understanding how there can be value without desire." And here's another example of how there can be value without desire, very interestingly. That's a thought for a later PhD, probably. Another aspect is then the fact that the experience is non-sensible. The white light doesn't last, it's only the transitional phase. There are no visions, there's no colours, there are no colours, no sounds, there's no proprioception, there's no feelings of the body, nothing. It is non-conceptual, there are no concepts whatsoever with which one can think. One cannot infer from concepts either. There's no reasoning, there's no rationality, there's no science, there's no logic. Interestingly, the state is also non-intentional. The state is not about something. The state is the only reality. There's not a thought about the state, or there's not fear about the state. The state and the mind are one. So on the right there, on the slide, you see I'm talking about an identity here, not a dichotomy of the real and the represented, that which represents the real. There's only the concrete. There's not the abstract anymore, and thus there is no subject-object dichotomy, no division between me and the experience. I am the experience. Of course, I can't think of I or the concept experience. Like I said, there's no cognition here at all. And importantly, the experience is non-temporal, by which is meant eternal. Time stops, but the state doesn't stop. Now this almost seems like a contradiction to say, but it is felt. And felt is not the right word. It's not emotional. In In fact, experience might not even be the right word either. It's transmental. It's more a state than experience, because experience has connotations of, sensibility and, emotionality, affectation, and so on. It's a state. It's not really an experience. Now, this, of course, is an apophatic, a negative way of describing what happens. I'm saying it's not this, it's not that, it's neither this nor that. The only positive thing really is the profundity of it. But the state is not nothing, it's not a blackout, it's excessively something. It's a whiteout in a way. It's extreme immersion into nothingness. And it lasts about 10 minutes. Afterwards, and this is can be a life-changing experience. What happens afterwards? What is the aftermath? Well, for many there seems to be a loss of the fear of death. Why that is, I'm not sure. Maybe it's a belief that this is death itself. It is, then, as Spinoza says, that stepping into the timeless eternity. Something of the mind remains. The bond, the love to God, to nature. Perhaps. There are recent studies suggestive of improved well-being. To be honest, I find this somewhat hard to fathom. It depends what you mean by well-being, I suppose. I don't see it really as a particularly therapeutic drug. Although if it gets rid of the fear of death, of course, that is therapeutic in one sense. And brings back new curiosities, another after effect of the occasion, which also can, of course, improve well-being, if you define it that way. Personally, I had this new horrific fear, fleetingly mind, once or twice, which is the dread of imprisonment within duration. Once you've experienced this, what seems like eternity at least, being within time suddenly seemed constraining. But that just might be me. There are other fears as well. Here are some reports from the Shulgin's book Tikal from 1997. Quote, 25 milligrams smoked 5-MeO began with a fast-rising sense of excitement and wonder, with an undertone of, now you've done it, but dominated by a sense of, wow, this is it. There was a tremendous sense of speed and acceleration. Perhaps 10 more seconds these feelings built to an intensity I'd never experienced before. The entire universe imploded through my consciousness. That was a relatively small dose. Another higher dose. I placed approximately 30 milligrams of 5-MeO into a pipe and smoked it in one toke, without a second thought. An instant later, I was crawled up on my bed in the fetal position, with my eyes closed, squirming around, screaming in my head, fuck, you killed yourself. That's the fear of death I speak of. Further, taking a larger dose, with an unknown but large amount smoked, I observed the subject pass very quickly into an almost coma-like state. Within seconds his face became purple and his breathing stopped. I pounded his chest and breathed for him, and he seemed to emerge in consciousness with a comment, "This is absolute ecstasy." In the awake condition he became increasingly lucid, but on closing his eyes he became possessed with what he called the energy of terror. He couldn't sleep, as upon closing his eyes he felt threatened in a way he could not tolerate. 3 days later, medical intervention with antipsychotic medication was provided. End quote. So this drug is not all fun and fairies. This is a serious drug, which I don't advocate mass use of at all. It's a very serious state to find oneself in. Let me now just finish off by talking about then, it's already implied in what I said, but I'll just make what was implicit a little bit more explicit, the comparison of this 5-MeO state with Spinoza's intellectual love of God. So on the left there I spoke of extreme profundity. Spinoza talks of blessedness, beatitude, the highest virtue, intellectual love. These things seem to be rather akin. Otherwise it's non-emotional. Now remember that God or nature has no conatus, no desire, and thus no emotions. Like I said, God doesn't love you. Not in the prosaic sense anyway. and intellectual love is not prosaic love. It's non-sensible. So for Spinoza, only the first kind of knowledge is sensible. Well, actually, the second kind of knowledge also uses the sensible, I should say. It's non-conceptual, though, or non-inferential, and this is the essence of the second kind of knowledge. So it's neither the first nor the second kind of knowledge, but the third. The 5-MeO state is non-intentional. It's not thought existing about something opposed to itself or different from itself. And this is what Spinoza talks about when he talks about the intellectual love of God as being a second birth, the second parallelism, the mind, the finite mind with the infinite intellect, the finite intellect with the infinite intellect. There's no subject-object dichotomy, as I say. Well, this is essential to intuition. It's a becoming one with the essence, the concrete reality of substance. It is essence, not abstraction, then. It is, the 5-MeO state is non-temporal or eternal. And of course, substance is eternal in itself. And this is what Spinoza writes about in the last part of the Ethics, that the third kind of knowledge is immersion into substance, God, nature, which in itself is eternal. And as this is no longer an abstractive knowledge of God, but a essential, concrete, adequate knowledge of God, thus it is the experience of being eternal. And I said it was transcendental. It's more a state than an experience. It's beyond then thought and extension, and the thoughts and the cognitions thereof. It is, as Pollock said, a manner of existence. A manner of existence which is different really from the physical type of existence and even the experiential type of existence. Something beyond both of those. It's beyond, in other words, the two attributes of thought and extension. It's not abstract, it's concrete. So then, if one accepts this, and of course it's arguable, but if one accepts that the intellectual love of God and certain psychedelic states, for example, that occasioned by 5-MeO, but it could also be LSD, we see similar things in high doses of LSD. If we accept this, that the intellectual love of God is akin to, or identical to, these psychedelic states, then we can understand psychedelic states through Spinozism, the Spinozan system. We can understand that they are not hallucinations, these unitive states, but they are veridical if one accepts that reality in itself, nature, God, is eternal in itself. So psychedelic states can be understood through this Spinozan system in a rational way. Why rational? Because it brings mind and matter together as identical things, as expressions of the same reality. This parallelism is more rational than substance dualism, that mind and matter interact. This was never explained, not even by Descartes. It's more rational than believing that the mind emerges from certain types of matter, emergentism, which is the dominant view in the West today, from the 1970s, Jae-Kwon Kim says. There are no scientific laws bridging the mental and the physical. There's just correlations. The question is, why are they correlated? In Spinozism, of course, you would expect correlation because we are talking again about the same thing. So, of course, there would be correlation with brain imaging. The question is how you interpret that correlation. One can interpret it as mental states emerging from physical states. Very problematic, like I said. There's no transordinal nomology, no bridge laws, and this, it's very hard to explain mental causation in an emergent system where you're talking about mental states as emerging from physical states. It's very hard to talk about downward causation, as Jae-Kwon Kim again pointed out very well. So psychedelic states can be understood through this very rational Spinozan system. In turn, the Spinozan system can be intuited through certain psychedelic states. So we have this lovely symbiosis going on. You can say, in Kantian terms perhaps, the rational system, Spinoza system, the rational system without the intuition is empty. The intuition without the rational system is blind. In other words, if one only has a rational system without the intuition, one doesn't really understand, one doesn't fully, adequately understand what it's about. This is perhaps the case with certain, not all, but certain scholars, who have never had this experience. They just cannot make heads or tails of it. As I say, explaining colour to the congenitally blind. On the other hand, the intuition, one can have the intuition without the rational system. So as opposed to scholars, perhaps one can talk about certain hippies or New Agers, not to be derogatory towards them, but people, I don't know, certain people who have this intuition, they think it's noetic, as James says, they think it's real, but they cannot integrate it within any form of rational understanding. And they say perhaps it's beyond rational understanding, which is partly true, but nonetheless, the rational understanding can certainly fortify the intuition one can have. So, psychedelics and Spinozism seem to work together symbiotically. They both fortify one another, and thus this can have very important ramifications upon the ecological crisis. For example, the founder of deep ecology, Norwegian philosopher Arne Næss, writes this: "No great philosopher has so much to offer in the way of clarification and articulation of basic ecological attitudes as Baruch Spinoza." And he's got some wonderful essays about this connection, Spinozism and deep ecology. If certain psychedelics can fortify Spinozism, and if Spinozism can fortify deep ecology in order to mitigate the ecological crisis, we can see the importance that psychedelics and abstract metaphysics can have for the current predicament in which we find ourselves. Anyway, I've gone over time, so I better stop there. I look forward to the discussion, but for now, I shall thank you for your time.